We're going to talk about American imperialism now, specifically the Trail of Tears. Here's the terms, not too many this time. Go ahead and get them down. As we move into the 19th century in America, we see that our country begins to expand. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory, the Louisiana Purchase, got it from France. This doubled the size of our country and meant that people now, Americans, start moving westward. There's land, there's opportunity. By 1840, nearly 7 million Americans, about 40% of the nation's population, lived in what's known as the Trans-Appalachian Territory. And this is land that was west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi River. So 40% of the population, that's a pretty good number. We continue to accumulate territory. We've got Americans moving down to Texas territory. Reaches a point where they outnumber the Mexicans. We have the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, where we add almost 30,000 square miles of Mexican territory to our country. And this is the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. We gain Texas, part of New Mexico, California, and other territory. So what's happening is that we're expanding our borders. By the early 19th century, Americans were expanding with a sense of mission. A lot of this was due to the idea of manifest destiny. This was the belief that American expansion westward was inevitable, just, and divinely foreordained. And we see that throughout the 19th century, Americans are expanding westward, settling in western territories, and claiming land in places like Mexico and Hawaii. Our country grew, but American expansion came at a price, and that price was paid by Native Americans and whoever else was in the way of settlement. It became the policy of the Jackson administration to remove all Native Americans east of the Mississippi River. President Jackson wrote to the Indians. He said, quote, "Where you now are, you and my white children are too near to each other to live in harmony and peace. Your game is gone, and many of your people will not work and till the earth. The land beyond the Mississippi belongs to the President and no one else, and he will give it to you forever." End quote. So basically he's saying that the Native Americans and the white men are just too close. They do not need to be living near each other. The natives have no game to hunt. They're not farming, so they have no food. And so he, Andrew Jackson, owns all the land on the other side, on the western side of the Mississippi, and he's going to give it to the Native Americans forever. There were 5 tribes living in the East who were known as the 5 civilized tribes, or they were called that. This included the Cherokee, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles here in Florida. Now, they all wanted to stay in their lands east of the Mississippi River. What happened was that gold was discovered in Georgia, and so there's a bit of a mini gold rush with private individuals flooding in to Georgia, staking their claims, and the government also wanted a peace. The problem was it's on Cherokee land, and the Cherokee are in the way. So this is one thing that prompted this decision to remove the Cherokee and the other tribes out to the west. Now, these people were settled, and many of them had adopted white men's ways. For example, the Cherokee had adopted a farming lifestyle. They had begun to receive formal educations. They had their own written language. They established their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. And they adopted the white men's idea of black slavery and even established their own plantations. So they're living just as the white men did. On May 28th of 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. This formalized his administration's policy of sending the Indians to the west. And this is referring again to those Indians living east of the Mississippi River on lands that the whites wanted. Well, during the next decade, the American government is going to pursue the removal of these southeastern tribes through a series of treaties that are negotiated in an atmosphere of intimidation and coercion. Well, the effort to force the Cherokees from their lands in Georgia produced the Treaty of New Echota. And this was signed by only a small faction of Cherokee. The majority of the Cherokee refused to leave their homes in Georgia, and they actually sued the state of Georgia in the U.S. Supreme Court in order to prevent their removal. But the President Jackson, got impatient, and he ended up dealing with just a small group of Cherokee who had concluded that further resistance was futile. And this group ended up signing the Treaty of New Echota, and they signed it on December 29th of 1835. What this did was it exchanged the title to all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi for $5 million and a large tract of land in Oklahoma. This document gave Jackson the ammunition he needed to remove the Cherokee. Now, the way the tribe worked was that there were these, I guess you could call them lesser chiefs, some of whom signed this treaty, but they answered to the president of the Cherokee Nation, much like the United States. Each state has its own governor, but each state government answers to the federal government and the president. That's kind of how it was here. And so just a small group signed this treaty, and the rest of the Cherokee protest. And they claim that, this treaty hadn't been signed by all the Cherokee chiefs. They didn't all agree. Unfortunately, they were ignored. Now, on the good side, the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the Cherokee claims to their lands in the east. So that's the good thing. The bad thing is that President Jackson just totally ignored it. He ignored the ruling and in the end forced the Cherokee to move to the west. The Indian Removal Act affected all the eastern tribes, but most famously it led to the forced removal of the Cherokee along what became known as the Trail of Tears. Jackson saw Indian removal as an opportunity to provide for the needs of the white farmers and businessmen. He also claimed the removal was in the best interest of the Indians. So what happens is that in 1838, the Georgia militia was ordered to force the Cherokee out of Georgia. And so 17,000 Cherokees were brutally rounded up and first placed in internment camps and then marched forcibly to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And this is what's known as the Trail of Tears. It was a very difficult journey. You've got men, women, children, the elderly, the sick. They had no choice. They had to leave everything behind and move out west. And here you see a map of Indian removal of the various tribes, including, as I said, the Seminole here in Florida. Now, I will say some of the Cherokee actually ran away. They escaped having to move out west, and many of them ran away into the Smoky Mountains. And today, if you ever go to Cherokee, North Carolina, that is an Indian reservation, and many of the Cherokee who are living there are actually descendants of those who had escaped into the mountains and lived there. And I actually urge you to go there they have an outdoor play that is put on every summer. I think it runs spring through like September or something like that. There's an outdoor amphitheater, and the play is called Unto These Hills, and they depict the history of the Cherokee Nation, including the Trail of Tears, and it's well worth seeing. So as I said, 17,000 Cherokee were forced to move westward, and it was a very brutal journey. Many of them actually were traveling during the winter, and more than 4,000 died on the journey westward. A Georgia soldier involved in the removal wrote, "I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by the thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." And so this is really one of the saddest episodes in our history, where we see men, women, children taken from their land, herded into makeshift forts with minimal facilities and food, and then forced to march 1,000 miles. Under the army commanders, who were pretty much indifferent to the people they were herding out west, human losses for the first groups of Cherokee that were removed were really, really high, because they ended up dividing the tribe into smaller units to move out west. Because the losses were so high in the first groups that traveled westward, and those first groups were being closely monitored by the soldiers, because the losses were so high, John Ross, the president of the Cherokee Nation, intervened. He made an urgent appeal to the Army commander, General Scott, and he requested that the general let his people lead the tribe west themselves so that they could forage for food. And General Scott agreed. So Ross organized the Cherokee into smaller groups and let them move separately through the wilderness. So, as I said, they could forage for food along the way, because that was one of the problems with the larger groups. They ran out of food to eat. And although the parties under Ross left in the early fall and arrived in Oklahoma during the brutal winter of 1838 to 39, he greatly reduced the loss of life among his people. But still, as I said, about 4,000 Cherokee died as a result of the removal. And then finally, during the spring of 1839, the Cherokee began to arrive in their new home, build new houses, clear land, plant, and just begin to rebuild their nation in their new home in Oklahoma. Sadly, the basic policy of Indian removal continued under the successor administrations throughout the 1800s. So as I said, by spring, they're settling into their new lives. The basic policy continues. And because this remains the basic policy of the successor administrations, it's going to result in continued warfare between the Native American tribes and the white men. As Americans continued to expand westward, they continue to come into contact with the various native tribes. And during the latter part of the 1800s, there's going to be a series of brutal wars between the American government and the Plains Indians. And these are the Indians a lot of people might think of when they think of Indians, wearing the war bonnets, living in teepees. These were horsemen who depended on the buffalo for their livelihood. And as the white men expanded, as the railroad tracks are laid across the plains, it disrupts the buffalo herds, disrupts the lives and the lifestyle of the natives, and they erupt into war. And at the same time, the government is trying to force them off their lands, off their hunting grounds, and onto reservations as well. So this warfare, this conflict, is going to continue almost until the end of the century.